Chapter 23 of Anne's House of Dreams by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. Owen Ford Comes. One evening Miss Cornelia telephoned down to Anne. "The writer man has just arrived here. I'm going to drive him down to your place, and you can show him the way over to Leslie's. It's shorter than driving round by the other road, and I'm in a mortal hurry. The Reese baby has gone and fallen into a pail of hot water at the Glen and got nearly scalded to death, and they want me right off, to put a new skin on the child, I presume. Mrs. Reese is always so careless, and then expects other people to mend her mistakes. You won't mind, will you, dearie? His trunk can go down tomorrow." "Very well," said Anne. "What is he like, Miss Cornelia?" "You'll see what he's like outside when I take him down. As for what he's like inside, only the Lord who made him knows that. I'm not going to say another word, for every receiver in the Glen is down." Miss Cornelia evidently can't find much fault with Mr. Ford's looks, or she would find it in spite of the receivers, said Anne. "I conclude, therefore, Susan, that Mr. Ford is rather handsome than otherwise." "Well, Mrs. Doctor, dear, I do enjoy seeing a well-looking man," said Susan candidly. "Had I not better get up a snack for him? There is a strawberry pie that would melt in your mouth." "No, Leslie is expecting him and has his supper ready. Besides, I want that strawberry pie for my own poor man. He won't be home till late, so leave the pie and a glass of milk out for him, Susan." "That I will, Mrs. Doctor, dear. Susan is at the helm. After all, it is better to give pie to your own man than to strangers, who may be only seeking to devour, and the doctor himself is as well-looking a man as you often come across." When Owen Ford came, Anne secretly admitted, as Miss Cornelia towed him in, that he was very well-looking indeed. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with thick brown hair, finely cut nose and chin, large and brilliant dark gray eyes. "And did you notice his ears and teeth, Mrs. Doctor, dear?" queried Susan later on. "He has got the nicest shaped ears I ever saw on a man's head. I am choice about ears. When I was young I was scared that I might have to marry a man with ears like flaps. But I need not have worried, for never a chance did I have with any kind of ears." Anne had not noticed Owen Ford's ears, but she did see his teeth, as his lips parted over them in a frank and friendly smile. Unsmiling, his face was rather sad and absent in expression, not unlike the melancholy, inscrutable hero of Anne's own early dreams. But mirth and humor and charm lighted it up when he smiled. Certainly, on the outside, as Miss Cornelia said, Owen Ford was a very presentable fellow. "You cannot realize how delighted I am to be here, Mrs. Blythe," he said, looking around him with eager, interested eyes. "I have an odd feeling of coming home. My mother was born and spent her childhood here, you know. She used to talk a great deal to me of her old home. I know the geography of it as well as of the one I lived in, and of course she told me the story of the building of the house, and of my grandfather's agonized watch for the Royal William. I had thought that so old a house must have vanished years ago, or I should have come to see it before this." "Old houses don't vanish easily on this enchanted coast," smiled Anne. "This is a land where all things always seem the same. Nearly always, at least. John Selwyn's house hasn't even been much changed, and outside the rose bushes your grandfather planted for his bride are blooming this very minute." "How the thought links me with them! With your leave, I must explore the whole place soon." "Our latch string will always be out for you," promised Anne. "And do you know that the old sea captain who keeps the Four Winds Light knew John Selwyn and his bride well in his boyhood? He told me their story the night I came here, the third bride of the old house." "Can it be possible? This is a discovery. I must hunt him up." "It won't be difficult. We're all cronies of Captain Jim. He will be as eager to see you as you could be to see him. Your grandmother shines like a star in his memory. But I think Mrs. Moore is expecting you. I'll show you our Crosslots road." Anne walked with him to the house up the brook, over a field that was as white as snow with daisies. A boatload of people were singing far across the harbor. The sound drifted over the water like faint, unearthly music wind-blown across a starlit sea. The big light flashed and beaconed. Owen Ford looked around him with satisfaction. "And so this is Four Winds," he said. "I wasn't prepared to find it quite so beautiful, in spite of all Mother's praises. What colors! What scenery! What charm! I shall get as strong as a horse in no time. And if inspiration comes from beauty, I should certainly be able to begin my great Canadian novel here." "You haven't begun it yet?" asked Anne. "Alackaday, no. I've never been able to get the right central idea for it. It lurks beyond me. It allures and beckons and recedes. I almost grasp it and it is gone. Perhaps amid this peace and loveliness I shall be able to capture it. Miss Bryant tells me that you write." "Oh, I do little things for children. I haven't done much since I was married. And I have no designs on a great Canadian novel," laughed Anne. "That is quite beyond me." Owen Ford laughed too. "I dare say it is beyond me as well. All the same, I mean to have a try at it some day, if I can ever get the time. A newspaper man doesn't have much chance for that sort of thing. I've done a good deal of short story writing for the magazines, but I've never had the leisure that seems to be necessary for the writing of a book. With 3 months of liberty, I ought to make a start, though. If I could only get the necessary motif for it, the soul of the book." An idea whisked through Anne's brain with a suddenness that made her jump. But she did not utter it, for they had reached the Moore house. As they entered the yard, Leslie came out on the veranda from the side door, peering through the gloom for some sign of her expected guest. She stood just where the warm yellow light flooded her from the open door. She wore a plain dress of cheap, cream-tinted cotton voile, with the usual girdle of crimson. Leslie was never without her touch of crimson. She had told Anne that she never felt satisfied without a gleam of red somewhere about her, if it were only a flower. To Anne, it always seemed to symbolize Leslie's glowing, pent-up personality, denied all expression save in that flaming glint. Leslie's dress was cut a little away at the neck and had short sleeves. Her arms gleamed like ivory-tinted marble. Every exquisite curve of her form was outlined in soft darkness against the light. Her hair shone in it like flame. Beyond her was a purple sky, flowering with stars over the harbor. Anne heard her companion give a gasp. Even in the dusk she could see the amazement and admiration on his face. "Who is that beautiful creature?" he asked. "That is Mrs. Moore," said Anne. "She's very lovely, isn't she?" I never saw anything like her," he answered rather dazedly. "I wasn't prepared. I didn't expect Good heavens, one doesn't expect a goddess for a landlady. Why, if she were clothed in a gown of sea purple with a rope of amethysts in her hair, she would be a veritable sea queen. And she takes in boarders." "Even goddesses must live," said Anne. "And Leslie isn't a goddess. She's just a very beautiful woman, as human as the rest of us. Did Miss Bryant tell you about Mr. Moore?" "Yes, he's mentally deficient or something of the sort, isn't he? But she said nothing about Mrs. Moore, and I supposed she'd be the usual hustling country housewife who takes in boarders to earn an honest penny." "Well, that's just what Leslie is doing," said Anne crisply. "And it isn't altogether pleasant for her either. I hope you won't mind, Dick. If you do, please don't let Leslie see it. It would hurt her horribly. He's just a big baby, and sometimes a rather annoying one." "Oh, I won't mind him. I don't suppose I'll be much in the house anyhow, except for meals. But what a shame it all is. Her life must be a hard one." "It is, but she doesn't like to be pitied." Leslie had gone back into the house and now met them at the front door. She greeted Owen Ford with cold civility and told him in a businesslike tone that his room and his supper were ready for him. Dick, with a pleased grin, shambled upstairs with the valise, and Owen Ford was installed as an inmate of the old house among the willows. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Anne's House of Dreams by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. The Life Book of Captain Jim. "I have a little brown cocoon of an idea that may possibly expand into a magnificent moth of fulfillment," Anne told Gilbert when she reached home. He had returned earlier than she had expected and was enjoying Susan's cherry pie. Susan herself hovered in the background, like a rather grim but beneficent guardian spirit, and found as much pleasure in watching Gilbert eat pie as he did in eating it. "What is your idea?" he asked. "I shan't tell you just yet, not till I see if I can bring the thing about." "What sort of a chap is Ford?" "Oh, very nice, and quite good looking." "Such beautiful ears, Doctor dear," interjected Susan with a relish. "He is about 30 or 35, I think, and he meditates writing a novel. His voice is pleasant and his smile delightful, and he knows how to dress. He looks as if life hadn't been altogether easy for him, somehow." Owen came over the next evening with a note to Anne from Leslie. They spent the sunset time in the garden and then went for a moonlit sail on the harbor in the little boat Gilbert had set up for summer outings. They liked Owen immensely, and had that feeling of having known him for many years which distinguishes the Freemasonry of the house of Joseph. "He is as nice as his ears, Mrs. Doctor, dear," said Susan when he had gone. He had told Susan that he had never tasted anything like her strawberry shortcake, and Susan's susceptible heart was his forever. "He has got a way with him," she reflected as she cleared up the relics of the supper. "It is real queer he is not married, for a man like that could have anybody for the asking. Well, maybe he is like me and has not met the right one yet." Susan really grew quite romantic in her musings as she washed the supper dishes. 2 nights later, Anne took Owen Ford down to Four Winds Point to introduce him to Captain Jim. The clover fields along the harbor shore were whitening in the western wind, and Captain Jim had one of his finest sunsets on exhibition. He himself had just returned from a trip over the harbor. "I had to go over and tell Henry Pollack he was dying. Everybody else was afraid to tell him. They expected he'd take on terrible, for he's been dreadful determined to live, and been making no end of plans for the fall. His wife thought he ought to be told, and that I'd be the best one to break it to him that he couldn't get better. Henry and me are old cronies. We sailed in the Gray Gulf for years together. Well, I went over and sat down by Henry's bed, and I says to him, says I, just right out plain and simple, for if a thing's got to be told it may as well be told first as last. Says I, 'Mate, I reckon you've got your sailing orders this time.' I was sort of quaking inside, for it's an awful thing to have to tell a man who ain't any idea he's dying that he is. But lo and behold, Mistress Blythe, Henry looks up at me with those bright old black eyes of his in his wizened face and says he, 'Tell me something I don't know, Jim Boyd, if you want to give me information. I've known that for a week.' I was too astonished to speak, and Henry he chuckled. 'To see you coming in here,' says he, 'with your face as solemn as a tombstone, and sitting down there with your hands clasped over your stomach, and passing me out a blue moldy old item of news like that. It'd make a cat laugh, Jim Boyd,' says he. 'Who told you?' says I, stupid like. 'Nobody,' says he. 'A week ago Tuesday night I was lying here awake, and I just knew. I'd suspicioned it before, but then I knew. I've been keeping up for the wife's sake, and I'd like to have got that barn built, for Eben'll never get it right. But anyhow, now that you've eased your mind, Jim, put on a smile and tell me something interesting.' Well, there it was. They'd been so scared to tell him, and he knew it all the time. Strange how nature looks out for us, ain't it, and lets us know what we should know when the time comes. Did I never tell you the yarn about Henry getting the fishhook in his nose, Mistress Blythe?" "No." "Well, him and me had a laugh over it today. It happened nigh on to 30 years ago. Him and me and several more was out mackerel fishing one day. It was a great day. Never saw such a school of mackerel in the Gulf. And in the general excitement Henry got quite wild and contrived to stick a fishhook clean through one side of his nose. Well, there he was. There was barb on one end and a big piece of lead on the other, so it couldn't be pulled out. We wanted to take him ashore at once, but Henry was game. He said he'd be jiggered if he'd leave a school like that for anything short of lockjaw. Then he kept fishing away, hauling in hand over fist and groaning between times. Finally the school passed and we come in with a load. I got a file and began to try to file through that hook. I tried to be as easy as I could, but you should have heard Henry. No, you shouldn't either. It was well no ladies were around. Henry wasn't a swearing man, but he'd heard some few matters of that sort along the shore in his time, and he fished 'em all out of his recollection and hurled 'em at me. Finally he declared he couldn't stand it, and I had no bowels of compassion. So we hitched up and I drove him to a doctor in Charlottetown, 35 miles. There weren't none nearer in them days, with that blessed hook still hanging from his nose. When we got there, old Dr. Crabb just took a file and filed that hook just the same as I'd tried to do, only he weren't a mite particular about doing it easy." Captain Jim's visit to his old friend had revived many recollections, and he was now in the full tide of reminiscences. "Henry was asking me today if I remembered the time old Father Chiniquy blessed Alexander McAllister's boat. Another odd yarn, and true as gospel. I was in the boat myself. We went out, him and me, in Alexander McAllister's boat one morning at sunrise. Besides, there was a French boy in the boat, Catholic, of course. You know old Father Chiniquy had turned Protestant, so the Catholics hadn't much use for him. Well, we sat out in the Gulf in the broiling sun till noon, and not a bite did we get. When we went ashore, old Father Chiniquy had to go, so he said in that polite way of his, 'I'm very sorry I cannot go out with you this afternoon, Mr. McAllister, but I leave you my blessing. You will catch 1,000 this afternoon.' Well, we did not catch 1,000, but we caught exactly 999, the biggest catch for a small boat in the whole North Shore that summer. Curious, wasn't it? Alexander McAllister, he says to Andrew Peters, 'Well, and what do you think of Father Chiniquy now?' 'Vell,' growled Andrew, 'I tink the old devil has got a blessing left yet.' Laws, how Henry did laugh over that today." "Do you know who Mr. Ford is, Captain Jim?" asked Anne, seeing that Captain Jim's fountain of reminiscence had run out for the present. "I want you to guess." Captain Jim shook his head. "I never was any hand at guessing, Mistress Blythe. And yet somehow when he come in I thought, where have I seen them eyes before? For I have seen 'em." "Think of a September morning many years ago," said Anne softly. "Think of a ship sailing up the harbor, a ship long waited for and despaired of. Think of the day the Royal William came in and the first look you had at the schoolmaster's bride." Captain Jim sprang up. "They're Persis Selwyn's eyes," he almost shouted. "You can't be her son. You must be her—" "Grandson, yes. I'm Alice Selwyn's son." Captain Jim swooped down on Owen Ford and shook his hand over again. "Alice Selwyn's son. Lord, but you're welcome. Many's the time I've wondered where the descendants of the schoolmaster were living. I knew there was none on the island. Alice, Alice, the first baby ever born in that little house. No baby ever brought more joy. I've dandled her 100 times. It was from my knee she took her first steps alone. Can't I see her mother's face watching her? And it was near 60 years ago. Is she living yet?" "No, she died when I was only a boy." "Oh, it doesn't seem right that I should be living to hear that," sighed Captain Jim. "But I'm heart glad to see you. It's brought back my youth for a little while. You don't know yet what a boon that is. Mistress Blythe here has the trick. She does it quite often for me." Captain Jim was still more excited when he discovered that Owen Ford was what he called a real writing man. He gazed at him as at a superior being. Captain Jim knew that Anne wrote, but he had never taken that fact very seriously. Captain Jim thought women were delightful creatures who ought to have the vote and everything else they wanted, bless their hearts, but he did not believe they could write. "Just look at a mad love," he would protest. "A woman wrote that, and just look at it. 103 chapters, when it could all have been told in 10. A writing woman never knows when to stop, that's the trouble. The p'int of good writing is to know when to stop." "Mr. Ford wants to hear some of your stories, Captain Jim," said Anne. "Tell him the one about the captain who went crazy and imagined he was the Flying Dutchman." This was Captain Jim's best story. It was a compound of horror and humor, and though Anne had heard it several times, she laughed as heartily and shivered as fearsomely over it as Mr. Ford did. Other tales followed, for Captain Jim had an audience after his own heart. He told how his vessel had been run down by a steamer, how he had been boarded by Malay pirates, how his ship had caught fire, how he had helped a political prisoner escape from a South African republic, how he had been wrecked one fall on the Magdalens and stranded there for the winter, how a tiger had broken loose on board ship, how his crew had mutinied and marooned him on a barren island. These and many other tales, tragic or humorous or grotesque, did Captain Jim relate. The mystery of the sea, the fascination of far lands, the lure of adventure, the laughter of the world, his hearers felt and realized them all. Owen Ford listened, with his head on his hand and the first mate purring on his knee, his brilliant eyes fastened on Captain Jim's rugged, eloquent face. "Won't you let Mr. Ford see your life book, Captain Jim?" asked Anne, when Captain Jim finally declared that yarn spinning must end for the time. "Oh, we don't want to be bothered with that," protested Captain Jim, who was secretly dying to show it. "I should like nothing better than to see it, Captain Boyd," said Owen. "If it is half as wonderful as your tales, it will be worth seeing." With pretend reluctance, Captain Jim dug his life book out of his old chest and handed it to Owen. "I reckon you won't care to wrastle along with my old hand o' write. I never had much schooling," he observed carelessly. "Just wrote that there to amuse my nephew Joe. He's always wanting stories. Comes here yesterday and says to me reproachful like, as I was lifting a 20-pound codfish out of my boat, 'Uncle Jim, ain't a codfish a dumb animal?' I'd been a telling him, you see, that he must be real kind to dumb animals and never hurt 'em in any way. I got out of the scrape by saying a codfish was dumb enough, but it wasn't an animal. But Joe didn't look satisfied, and I wasn't satisfied myself. You gotta be mighty careful what you tell them little critters. They can see through you." While talking, Captain Jim watched Owen Ford from the corner of his eye as the latter examined the life book, and presently observing that his guest was lost in its pages, he turned smilingly to his cupboard and proceeded to make a pot of tea. Owen Ford separated himself from the life book with as much reluctance as a miser wrenches himself from his gold, long enough to drink his tea, and then returned to it hungrily. "Oh, you can take that thing home with you if you want," said Captain Jim, as if the thing were not his most treasured possession. "I must go down and pull my boat up a bit on the skids. There's a wind coming. Did you notice the sky tonight? Mackerel skies and mare's tails make tall ships carry short sails." Owen Ford accepted the offer of the life book gladly. On their way home, Anne told him the story of lost Margaret. "That old captain is a wonderful old fellow," he said. "What a life he has led! Why, the man has had more adventures in 1 week of his life than most of us have in a lifetime. Do you really think his tales are all true?" "I certainly do. I'm sure Captain Jim could not tell a lie. And besides, all the people about here say that everything happened as he relates it. There used to be plenty of his old shipmates alive to corroborate him. He's one of the last of the old type of P.E. Island sea captains. They're almost extinct now." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Anne's House of Dreams by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. The Writing of the Book. Owen Ford came over to the little house the next morning in a state of great excitement. "Mrs. Blythe, this is a wonderful book, absolutely wonderful. If I could take it and use the material for a book, I feel certain I could make the novel of the year out of it. Do you suppose Captain Jim would let me do it?" "Let you? I'm sure he would be delighted," cried Anne. "I admit that it was what was in my head when I took you down last night. Captain Jim has always been wishing he could get somebody to write his life book properly for him. Will you go down to the Point with me this evening, Mrs. Blythe? I'll ask him about that life book myself, but I want you to tell him that you told me the story of lost Margaret, and ask him if he will let me use it as a thread of romance with which to weave the stories of the life book into a harmonious whole." Captain Jim was more excited than ever when Owen Ford told him of his plan. At last his cherished dream was to be realized and his life book given to the world. He was also pleased that the story of lost Margaret should be woven into it. "It will keep her name from being forgotten," he said wistfully. "That's why I want it put in." "We'll collaborate," cried Owen delightedly. "You will give the soul and I the body. Oh, we'll write a famous book between us, Captain Jim, and we'll get right to work." "And to think my book is to be writ by the schoolmaster's grandson," exclaimed Captain Jim. "Lad, your grandfather was my dearest friend. I thought there was nobody like him. I see now why I had to wait so long. It couldn't be writ till the right man come. You belong here. You've got the soul of this old North Shore in you. You're the only one who could write it." It was arranged that the tiny room off the living room at the lighthouse should be given over to Owen for a workshop. It was necessary that Captain Jim should be near him as he wrote, for consultation upon many matters of seafaring and Gulf lore, of which Owen was quite ignorant. He began work on the book the very next morning, and flung himself into it heart and soul. As for Captain Jim, he was a happy man that summer. He looked upon the little room where Owen worked as a sacred shrine. Owen talked everything over with Captain Jim, but he would not let him see the manuscript. "You must wait until it is published," he said. "Then you'll get it all at once in its best shape." He delved into the treasures of the life book and used them freely. He dreamed and brooded over lost Margaret until she became a vivid reality to him and lived in his pages. As the book progressed, it took possession of him, and he worked at it with feverish eagerness. He let Anne and Leslie read the manuscript and criticize it, and the concluding chapter of the book, which the critics later on were pleased to call idyllic, was modeled upon a suggestion of Leslie's. Anne fairly hugged herself with delight over the success of her idea. "I knew when I looked at Owen Ford that he was the very man for it," she told Gilbert. "Both humor and passion were in his face, and that, together with the art of expression, was just what was necessary for the writing of such a book. As Mrs. Rachel would say, he was predestined for the part. Owen Ford wrote in the mornings. The afternoons were generally spent in some merry outing with the Blythes. Leslie often went too, for Captain Jim took charge of Dick frequently in order to set her free. They went boating on the harbor and up the 3 pretty rivers that flowed into it. They had clam bakes on the bar and mussel bakes on the rocks. They picked strawberries on the sand dunes. They went out cod fishing with Captain Jim. They shot plover in the shore fields and wild ducks in the cove. At least the men did. In the evenings they rambled in the low-lying, daisied shore fields under a golden moon, or they sat in the living room at the little house, where often the coolness of the sea breeze justified a driftwood fire, and talked of the 1,001 things which happy, eager, clever young people can find to talk about. Ever since the day on which she had made her confession to Anne, Leslie had been a changed creature. There was no trace of her old coldness and reserve, no shadow of her old bitterness. The girlhood of which she had been cheated seemed to come back to her with the ripeness of womanhood. She expanded like a flower of flame and perfume. No laugh was readier than hers, no wit quicker in the twilight circles of that enchanted summer. When she could not be with them, all felt that some exquisite savor was lacking in their intercourse. Her beauty was illumined by the awakened soul within, as some rosy lamp might shine through a flawless vase of alabaster. There were hours when Anne's eyes seemed to ache with the splendor of her. As for Owen Ford, the Margaret of his book, although she had the soft brown hair and elfin face of the real girl who had vanished so long ago, pillowed where lost Atlantis sleeps, had the personality of Leslie Moore, as it was revealed to him in those halcyon days at Four Winds Harbor. All in all, it was a never-to-be-forgotten summer, one of those summers which come seldom into any life, but leave a rich heritage of beautiful memories in their going, one of those summers which, in a fortunate combination of delightful weather, delightful friends, and delightful doings, come as near to perfection as anything can come in this world. Too good to last, Anne told herself with a little sigh on the September day when a certain nip in the wind and a certain shade of intense blue on the Gulf water said that autumn was hard by. That evening Owen Ford told him that he had finished his book and that his vacation must come to an end. "I have a good deal to do to it yet, revising and pruning and so forth," he said, "but in the main it's done. I wrote the last sentence this morning. If I can find a publisher for it, it will probably be out next summer or fall." Owen had not much doubt that he would find a publisher. He knew that he had written a great book, a book that would score a wonderful success, a book that would live. He knew that it would bring him both fame and fortune. But when he had written the last line of it, he had bowed his head on the manuscript and so sat for a long time, and his thoughts were not of the good work he had done. End of chapter 25.